seems fair, but I'm pretty sure most of you wouldn't want to commit a whole semester anyway, so maybe 2 hours is the best approach. So for those of you who don't know me, most of you do, but let's not make assumptions. I'm Kevin Enns-Rempel. For many years, I was the archivist in the Mennonite Library and Archives at Fresno Pacific University. So while not specifically a scholar of this topic, and I do not occupy the same lofty heights as people such as Abe Friesen and the late Peter Clausen and the late Paul Taves, all members of this church who are among the world's leading scholars in topics related to this. I'm not quite like them, but I've picked up a few things along the way, so hopefully I can help summarize some of these topics. Given that this is 2 hours total, you will be subjected to no end of sweeping generalizations and gross oversimplifications. We just don't have any choice. That's how it's going to work. So we are Willow Avenue Mennonite Church, and that name tells us something about the context in which this congregation exists. We're a Mennonite church. It's something we've strongly valued, something that we have closely identified with throughout our history. So over the next 2 weeks, I want to try to help us understand a little bit about the background of this movement, how and why it got started, how it has evolved over time, what its most distinctive characteristics are, and then also the present day landscape in which it exists. This week, we're going to do the parts before we get to North America. Next week, we'll do the parts after we get to North America. And then next week, also look a little bit at this whole thing that some of you who don't come from the tradition might have picked up on. They all seem to be related to each other. And what's going on there? I thought this was a church, not a family reunion. And so, yeah, I think we do need to acknowledge the reality of that, how it happened, for better or for worse. That's next week. So here we'll start at the beginning and work our way up to through the European story. So Mennonites, as we're known today, trace their origins to something called the Anabaptist movement, which first takes shape in the 1520s, so the early 16th century. For those of you who know your church history, you know there's lots of stuff going on in the early 16th century. This is the time of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, John Calvin, other Reformed leaders, for the first time successfully challenging the hegemony of the Roman Catholic Church, the only church in Western Europe for over a millennium at this point. Other people had challenged it along the way, but never with a lot of success. They didn't get a lot of traction. In the early 16th century, there's a lot of traction indeed. And indeed, Christendom sort of breaks up into pieces in a way that had not been the case prior to this time. The Anabaptists are part of that movement. In some ways, they're like the Lutherans, they're like the Calvinist reformers. In other ways, they are quite different. The other thing that's worth saying, this is one of the oversimplifications and generalizations. I'm going to try to sum up who Anabaptists were in a few handy points. In fact, they are a very diverse, highly differentiated group of movements who often wouldn't have agreed with each other, especially in the early years, but will, while acknowledging that, try to say something about the things that do hold them together. So Anabaptists. The term means rebaptizer, and it comes from the fact that, and this is the one thing you can absolutely say for sure about Anabaptists, because if this wasn't true, why would we call them that? They rejected the infant baptism that was practiced, of course, by the Roman Catholic Church, but also by every other Reformed group that breaks off from the Catholics at this time. They said that baptism isn't valid. And they chose as adults to be rebaptized. To be a Christian, they argued, was to make an adult decision to follow Christ. And baptism then was a subsequent symbol of having made that decision. It wasn't something that got decided for you. Your mom and dad don't get to say it. The local officials don't get to say it. You're the one who has to say it. It's not a terribly revolutionary concept now, but as we'll see here in a moment, it's really revolutionary at the time they're saying it. Infants, of course, have no ability to make decisions to follow Christ. And so why would we baptize them? The Anabaptists ask. It's completely inappropriate. Now, within Europe at this time, infant baptism wasn't just the way you became a member of the church. It was also the way you were incorporated into an entire Christian society. Church and state were linked together in a way that you could scarcely tell where one ended and the other began. The rulers of that time, whether they were ecclesiastical rulers or civil rulers, believed that the only way to maintain social order was if church membership and state citizenship were treated as a package deal. You can't have people with radically different faiths trying to coexist in the same society and still maintain order. That's a nightmare. We can't do it. So to be a citizen of a particular state was also to be a member of whatever church was established in that state. And of course, going back for centuries and centuries, there had been only one choice. You were Catholic, because that's the church of wherever it was you were living in Western Europe. Now, suddenly in the 16th century, there become options. But nonetheless, the assumption still was that there will be a state church. It might be Lutheran now instead of Catholic, or it might be Reformed, but there's still a state church. But the Anabaptists rejected that notion. They said, not only are we opposed to infant baptism because infants don't know what they're talking about, they can't make those decisions. We also don't approve of that linkage. There shouldn't be that coercion of the state influencing decisions about church membership. So what the Anabaptists did was heresy against the church, but it was also sedition against the state. And that's a very dangerous combination, especially at that time. And the Anabaptists in the 16th century, as we shall see in a moment, were treated accordingly. Now, I mentioned that other reformers at this time still bought into the idea of infant baptism and state churches. They rejected the idea that the Roman Catholics should have a monopoly on that thing, but they said, well, this is now a Lutheran region. The Lutheran Church is now established, or the Calvinist Reformed Church is established, but we still have an established church. So the Anabaptists didn't just run afoul of Roman Catholicism. They ran afoul of everybody at the time. And again, we'll see a little more about what running afoul means. Okay, so here is our first attempt at some real simplifications. I already mentioned Anabaptism in the early years especially comes in a lot of different varieties. Anabaptism springs up in various parts of Europe. We'll look at a map in a second that shows some of those. And not surprisingly, especially at that time when communication isn't that easy over large areas, the way Anabaptist takes shape in one part of Europe is going to look different than the way it takes shape in others. And in other cases, even when they were close together, they didn't all agree on these sort of things. But nonetheless, we will try to summarize a few things. This is, I think, a fairly good summary of the way Anabaptism comes to function, even if at first it took a while to get here. So the first point we've already mentioned, rejection of infant baptism and the linkage between church and state. That's the one thing you can sort of say for sure here. It's the only item that applies to all Anabaptists. Indeed, it's what makes them Anabaptists. Secondly, certainly over time, most Anabaptists came to argue that to be Christian is to live peaceably with all people. If you are a believer, you should never take up arms, whether that's on behalf of the state or on behalf of your own interests. God will protect you. God takes care of those things. It's not your task to do so. There are wrongdoers in the world, but it is not our job to use force to stop them. Believers shouldn't swear oaths. Those are forms of allegiance to earthly governments. They're saying, I will do whatever you ask. And often that involves violence. So you don't swear allegiance to the state. And you don't refer disputes between believers to courts for resolution. The Anabaptists, for the most part, were very clear on that idea, that that's another form of coercion and force that Christians should not be engaged in. Third, the Anabaptists, and this is not unique to them, there were other Protestant groups similar to this, but generally a rejection of rigidly hierarchical leadership models. Certainly there's no pope and cardinals and bishops and priests who sort of function as intermediaries between God and garden variety believers. It's not to say that Anabaptists didn't have strong leaders, they really did, but it is to say that you didn't assume that those people somehow occupied a status that was more important than just all the rest of us. We get together and we discuss as fellow believers what the Bible is telling us to do. We don't have this sort of hierarchy that has done it for us. It's what historians came to call a priesthood of all believers. Each one of us is a priest, as it were, in terms of our ability to, interact with God together with all of our other believers. Christianity for the Anabaptists was about believing. I mean, there is doctrine. You have, you're supposed to believe certain things. But ultimately, what really matters for the Anabaptists is the doing part. Okay, you say you believe something. Now, how does that change your life? How does that affect the way you live? Because you can assent to any doctrine you want, and that's all fine and good. But if it doesn't change the way you live, does it mean anything? And Anabaptists really jump to that question. I mean, all Christians ultimately do ask those kinds of questions. It's not like there are Christian traditions that say what you do doesn't matter, but Anabaptists tended to go there much faster and put much more emphasis on it. Relatively little effort put into crafting complex doctrinal statements. If you look at the early Anabaptists' writings, they're going to take up some space on your shelf, but not terribly much, even if you gather them all. Certainly if you compare them to what Luther wrote, to what Calvin wrote, to what the early church fathers wrote, way less. Now, part of that, we haven't yet talked much about the whole martyrdom part of the Anabaptist story, but I've hinted at it. When you are running for your life, perhaps you don't spend as much time crafting theological documents as you otherwise might. But I suspect even if they hadn't been running for their lives, they probably wouldn't have spent as much time crafting theological documents. We have the Bible. We sit down together, we read it, we ask it what it's saying to us, and then we ask ourselves what we should do about it. How much other theologizing do you really need? And so for that reason, you don't see nearly as much of that sort of complex theology. You see much more of a practical, how then shall we live? When you look at the kind of things that show up in Mennonite confessions of faith over time, it's far less on abstract concepts and how we live together, communion and washing of feet and all kinds of very practical kind of things, living peacefully in the world, not, transubstantiation and whatever other fancy theological words take up space in a lot of other theological documents. Okay, moving on. Most Anabaptists would have agreed that Christians will always live in tension with the world. There is the kingdom of the world and there is the kingdom of God. And once you become a Christian, you have become part of that kingdom of God, and therefore you are not part of the kingdom of the world. That gets back to, not taking up arms on behalf of the state. You don't run for public office. You do not occupy any rank within society that somehow ties you to the government. Now, while not all Anabaptists would have said this at first, some of them were quite revolutionary and radical. Over time, most Anabaptists would have argued that government is to be passively obeyed. We're not firebrand revolutionaries. We aren't out to make trouble. We're just, just keeping our heads down here. But we aren't going to play an active part in that government. It would later come to be known, again, just like priesthood of all believers, a fancy way of saying this, two-kingdom theology is the term that's often used for this idea that we are part of the kingdom of the world, of the kingdom of God, and we are not part of the kingdom of the world. The Catholic Church would have always argued that those, the church sort of leavens the state, it imposes itself, it links itself together, and that's how it's supposed to work. Anabaptists would have said, everything goes wrong when you try to do that. You just can't. Those two things are different. And then the last summary here. Oh, I left one off. Okay, there is one more. Church discipline. Most Anabaptists would have argued that to be a part of the church is to be held accountable by the other people who are in that church, and your behaviors, maybe your beliefs, but certainly your behaviors, will be scrutinized by that group. And if you do not live up to the standards, you should be excommunicated. You should be set aside, no longer be a part of the church until you mend your ways, confess, and then you're welcomed back in. How far that excommunication went depended on the group. For some, it was simply you're no longer a member of the church. For others, it was you are no longer a member of the church, and no church members should have any social interaction with you. You don't go to their houses for dinner, or vice versa. Some even argued about whether spouses should have spousal sort of relations. That was there's less certainty about that one. Often even fairly strict Anabaptists said, well, we won't go that far. Some argued they should have. But however that plays out, it was taken very seriously. It would be a mistake, I think, to really describe Anabaptists as being tolerant in the way that we think of it today. They were not an easy come, easy go, I'm okay, you're okay, let's just all agree to be friends here kind of people. The early Anabaptist writings often use very harsh language to describe other belief systems. We'll talk about Menno Simons here in a minute, but there's lots of Horror of Babylon sort of language in his writing. They weren't tolerant in a 21st century definition, but since they would have argued, but we don't kill them for it. In the context of the 16th century, that's pretty darn tolerant. So let's give them credit for that. They would have still harshly condemned these things that they saw to be wrong and would have kicked people out of their churches who didn't live up to their standards. And yet, there were no burnings at the stake. There were no gallows. There were no drownings in the river. So, okay, good for them. Now, not all Anabaptists would have agreed with all these. For instance, living peaceably with all people. There were Anabaptists in the German city of Münster who were radical revolutionaries. They attempted to set up their own Anabaptist theocracy in Münster, along with practicing polygamy. It was pretty wild. They were happy to use violence. They were happy to, as it would have been said then, take up the sword. Not surprisingly, they were treated extremely harshly. The Münsterite revolutionaries were eventually defeated. They were executed by the ruling authorities. And for centuries after that, opponents of Anabaptism used that example and others like it to define Anabaptism. These are scary people. They are dangerous. They will revolt against society and the governments of those societies. And that's why we can't tolerate them. Okay, moving on. Geographical roots. So Anabaptism pops up over a variety of parts of Western Europe, mostly German and Dutch-speaking parts of Europe, though with some other exceptions. You can see here those sort of rust-colored areas are the darker colors. So there's also some darker pink up there on the top. That's sort of the center of the population, and then it spreads out to other places. So Switzerland is certainly one of those heartlands, the city of Zurich. Some people would argue that's where Anabaptism begins. Others would argue, well, maybe it's not quite that simple. It springs up more or less simultaneously in a variety of areas. We will not get into that debate. The Netherlands is so up there farther to the northwest is another major population center. Our church is most closely tied to that tradition. Not exclusively, but the tradition, and we'll see how these people migrate later and get to different places. But that Dutch Mennonite story is sort of the most significant one to our tradition. Other parts of Europe, the south and central Germany, Moravia, the Tyrol region, which doesn't really show here, we'll see it on another map, which is sort of where Italy and Switzerland and Austria all meet. So it pops up in various places. Again, that's part of the reason why it does take different shapes early on, because in the 16th century, you didn't quickly communicate between all those areas terribly easily. So that, in a nutshell, is something about the Anabaptist beginnings. But we're not called Anabaptists today. We're called Mennonites. So where'd that come from? Well, it came from this guy, or somebody who may have looked something like him. We have Menno Simons is the man for whom Mennonites are named. So we're named after his first name, not his last. We could have been the Simonites, I guess, but no, we're Mennonites. We have no idea what Menno looked like. There are no portraits of him from life. Here are a bunch of fanciful attempts at defining what he might have looked like. Some of them bear a resemblance to each other, others not really much at all, because they're all wild guesses. I should note that the one in the middle is a pencil portrait by Rodney Harder, a former member of our congregation. Many of you will remember him from years ago. Lives in New York now. So he is part of that tradition of artists, often kind of working off of other portraits before. Anyway, it's Menno. Menno was originally a Dutch Catholic priest. He was, by his own admission, a rather indifferent Catholic priest. He says he never read the Bible during all of his training to become a priest. He spent much of his time playing cards. Once he was a priest, it was a good gig. He had a nice job, and that's his own admission. He did, though, pay attention to these things. He wasn't totally indifferent, and he did start to have questions. He actually did start to read the Bible, and he saw things in there that made him question certain aspects of Catholic theology, especially relating to baptism and church membership. Okay, seems to be a theme here. He was aware that there were these people called Anabaptists. He was a Dutch Catholic priest, and there were a lot of Anabaptists in the Netherlands, so they were around him. Indeed, his brother Peter was one of them. His brother Peter was an Anabaptist who was killed in 1535 because he was taking part in revolutionary activity, not in Munster, but inspired by it. So he had a brother who wasn't just an Anabaptist, but who was one of the really revolutionary ones. Now, Menno was troubled by that. He wasn't particularly convinced that what those people were doing was a good idea, but he was intrigued and troubled by the claims they were making. And so he's having a full-blown spiritual crisis with regard to the doctrine of the church in which he had always been a part and in which he was now a priest. In 1536, so the Anabaptist movement starts in the mid to late 1520s, so somewhere in the vicinity of a decade after it had begun, Menno renounces his priesthood, leaves the Catholic Church, and is rebaptized as an Anabaptist. So you'll sometimes hear Menno described as the person who founded this movement. He didn't. He comes along somewhat later. But what he does is he quickly rises to a level of influence within the movement. He wrote extensively here, and you can come up afterwards if you like rare book petting zoos. Here's a 1681 edition of Menno Simon's writings. Old books are cool. He wrote a lot. He traveled a lot. He would have visited various places where those Anabaptists were living. He helped argue for a certain kind of Anabaptism. He certainly argued against those more revolutionary aspects of it. He would have said, no, to be a Christian is to live peacefully, to live somewhat more quietly than some of you are trying to do, to take very seriously ideas like church discipline, which Menno did take very seriously. I don't know if this is an entirely good analogy, but you could sort of argue that Menno is to the Anabaptist movement as St. Paul is to the Christian movement. Maybe. You know, Paul is not the founder of Christianity, but he plays this very important role through writing and traveling of kind of knitting together what was otherwise kind of a disparate group of people who shared some things but not others. Anabaptists were in very much the same situation as new movements like this often are. They've kind of got certain things they agree on, but other things they don't at all, and they don't quite know how to sort those things out. Menno played a huge role in that. So much so that people started calling these Anabaptists Mennists or Mennonites. Now, in both the case of Anabaptist and Mennonites, they weren't names that we chose for ourselves. Indeed, the early Anabaptists would have said, we're not Anabaptists. We've only been baptized once. Somebody dumped water on our heads when we were babies. We're not quite sure what that was, but it wasn't a baptism. We've only been baptized once. And all of you in the Catholic Church or the Lutheran or the Reformed Church, you've never been baptized at all. We'd rather just call ourselves brethren or baptizers or Christians. Anabaptist is a term that kind of got applied to them. And the same is true of Mennonites. Most Anabaptists probably weren't all that keen on the idea that they'd be named after another man. We're Christians, we're not followers of Menno, but as is often the case, these terms do stick, and eventually we decide we can live with them. So by at least 1544, that term, some version of the word Mennonite is being used to describe Anabaptists. Ironically, today, the one country that does not officially use, of the historic Anabaptist regions, the one country that doesn't call themselves Mennonites, the Netherlands, Menno's home country. They are the doopsgezind, baptism-minded, basically. Everywhere else decided they could live with Mennonites, but the Dutch didn't. So anyway, not sure what that's all about. Okay, moving along here. I've already hinted at it, but Anabaptists were viciously persecuted. The leaders of both the church and the state, which of course often were more or less the same thing, throughout Europe viewed Anabaptism and Mennonitism as a very dangerous thing. Not just because it's heresy again, but because it's sedition. It's disloyalty to the state. These people are dangerous. Its adherents were imprisoned, they were exiled, they were tortured, and they were killed for their beliefs. We don't know how many were killed. There just aren't accurate numbers to document that, but historians have estimated, maybe somewhere around 5,000 of them were put to death. The numbers vary. The experience of martyrdom was so central to Anabaptism that many of these stories were memorialized in a really big book, this one, which first published in 1660. This edition is a second edition, 1685, that we today call the Martyr's Mirror. And it is, the first half of it are stories of people killed for their faith before the Anabaptist movement. And the second half, or a little bit more than the second half, are those who were killed in the 1600s and 1700s, or no, 1500s and 1600s, for their faith as Anabaptists. Very detailed, often gruesome stories. This second edition also includes etchings. There are 3 of those shown here on the screen of Anabaptist martyrdom events. The book has many more of those. So again, if you want to come take a look at those afterwards, I'll have them up here. And that very much shapes the Anabaptist self-understanding. This idea that to be a Christian is going to cost you. And I suppose that's another thing we could have actually put on that list. It doesn't come without implications, because these beliefs fly in the face of very strongly held assumptions out there in the world, and they won't like it, and they will deal with you accordingly. And that just comes with the territory. And you put together a book like this to remind people of that. Indeed, by the late 1600s, the man who wrote this book, Tieleman van Bracht, was starting to think that Mennonites were getting soft and they were forgetting that story. And so part of the reason to put this together is to remind people of that fact. Anyway, so Anabaptists to begin with, and the Mennonites, some of them are quite radical, quite aggressive, quite confrontational. You know, sometimes they would do wacky things like run naked through the streets of Amsterdam. I'm not quite sure why, but there is such a story. They were all killed, by the way. So just saying, you can't let people do that. Over time, Mennonites start to alter their view of how they ought to interact with the world. Menno's influence certainly played a part in that. He would have argued that that doesn't really have a place. A quiet faithfulness is more appropriate than an in-your-face kind of rebellion. And the reality that a lot of them understood is the more trouble like that we make, the more trouble it's going to be for us. So maybe we should just separate ourselves, keep our heads down, be quiet, and hopefully they won't kill so many of us. They became what in German was known as die Stillen im Lande, the quiet in the land. And I think much of Mennonite identity over the years since then, sort of a quiet people, not terribly flashy. We kind of often more or less keep to ourselves, at least historically, comes out of those ideas that maybe it's best not to be quite so aggressive in all those things. Now, the other thing you do if you're trying to keep your head down and stay out of trouble is move. If one place doesn't like you a lot, maybe you can find a place that is at least willing to tolerate you somewhat. And so Mennonites start moving. And it has been a part of our story, either almost entirely or at least for small groups, ever since. I mean, these migrations haven't stopped to this day, even though Mennonites like us have kind of concluded that it's not what we do anymore. But there are still some who definitely do, generally the more culturally conservative groups. But to begin with, it really does define who Mennonites are. So Swiss Mennonites, you can see the area of Switzerland there sort of on the left. A lot of them moved north into an area known as the Palatinate, which is kind of along the French and German border, the Alsace-Lorraine, same general area. It's a war-torn area that doesn't always offer them quite the peace and quiet that they might have wanted. Many of them move on fairly quickly from there. There is an arrow going from the Palatinate up to Rotterdam. That does not mean they move to the Netherlands. That's shorthand to saying they need to get to a port city so they can move to Pennsylvania. We'll talk about that next week. But Swiss Mennonites, and so just sort of to jump ahead a little bit to next week, when you encounter Mennonites in the eastern part of the United States, you're almost always, with some exceptions, encountering people who would have originated in Switzerland or South Germany, many of whom would have moved to the Palatinate and then found their way to Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, other Mennonites, mostly in the Netherlands, also very harshly persecuted, discover that there's this place to the east of them. sometimes called Poland, sometimes called Prussia. When Mennonites use those two terms, Prussia or Poland, same thing. At various times, depending on who's in charge of the government, they would have been known as different things, but just assume they're synonymous for Mennonites. Around the city that was then known as Danzig, today it's Gdansk, the Vistula River Delta, kind of a triangular area that drops down from Danzig. It was one of the first political entities in Europe to say, maybe there's room to tolerate people with other religious beliefs. This is the story that Nancy's husband, Peter, spent much of his life telling. Peter Clausen has written the most extensive and authoritative works in English, certainly, on the story of Mennonites in Poland and Prussia. And he argued that, the religious toleration that's exhibited in Poland is very influential. In fact, I've heard him in lectures talk about the fact that the American founding fathers, at least in part, were getting some of their ideas about religious freedom from what was happening in places like Poland. So Mennonites start moving there from the Netherlands as early as the 1530s. There aren't arrows on the map showing it, but some Swiss Mennonites, some Moravian Mennonites, some German Mennonites also find their way up into Poland. So if there's one place where our kind, if I may call it that, Mennonites have lived the longest, it's really Poland. Many of us talk about the fact that, our descendants were Russian Mennonites, but for lots of us, that was a very short story. The Poland story went on for several hundred years. It's where the ethno-religious identity really first came into being. It's where we picked up this language called Plattdeutsch, or Low German. We'll talk about that a little more when we talk about ethno-religious stuff next week. But Mennonites, so they're Dutch-speaking at first mostly, though the others who come later, of course, are speaking other languages. They all move up here into this region of Poland, and they do eventually adopt the sort of language of the region, which is Plattdeutsch. It's an oral language at that point. It's not written. So all of these Mennonites become bilingual. When they go to church on Sunday and they have to deal with, the Bible, something that's written down, well, then you're either doing Dutch at first or later on German. But when you go home, when you're at in the barnyard on the street corner, then you're speaking Low German. And they are two completely different languages. Low German or flat German refers to the fact that it came from the lowlands, not that it's inferior. Many people think, it's this awful inferior version of German. It's actually a completely different language than German. Anyway, we won't get too much into the weeds on the Low German language, but it becomes a big part of our identity. Most of us who have those kind of ancestors, grandparents at least, would have spoken it. I mean, when my grandma answered the phone at her house and it was one of her sisters, instantly she switched to Plattdeutsch. I didn't have the faintest idea what she was talking about, but even, it's the 1960s, for goodness sake. She's still speaking that language as sort of her default language. That happens in Poland. So Mennonites find that to be a happy home for a very long time. It's relatively tolerant. There are certainly restrictions. The assumption was that you will kind of stay quiet. You won't make a lot of waves, which for a lot of Mennonites, it's like, that's fine with us. Over time, governments have a way of changing. The Prussian Empire, which actually comes to control that area, is a somewhat more militaristic kind of government. They are putting pressure on people to serve in their military. They are putting pressure on Mennonites to do that. You people are farmers, you want farmland, you want to be able to buy land, you will send your sons to fight in our army. If you're not willing to do that, no land for you. Well, that was a problem. So a lot of these Mennonites are starting to have second thoughts about living in Poland. And as luck would have it, there's a certain lady in Russia, the Tsarina, Catherine the Great, who is wanting settlers to come move to an area sometimes called New Russia, sometimes called South Russia. Today, we'd call it Ukraine. It's land that the Russian Empire had recently seized from, or at least seized political control of. And a good way to sort of consolidate that control is to get people to move there and farm and do all that kind of stuff. And so she sends out this all points bulletin across Europe, but especially the German-speaking people, to come settle in New Russia. Large numbers of people do it, including Mennonites. Mennonites are a small portion of the people who do move there, but it's a very important part of the story, almost entirely from Poland, or you see there's those blue lines across the bottom of the map, from the Tyrol to Moravia to Russia. That's actually the story of a church known as the Hutterites, another Anabaptist group. We won't get into a lot of detail about them. They are communists in the true sense of the word. They believe that all goods are to be held in common within the community, much more sort of separatist than the Mennonites we're used to hanging out with. They follow a completely different route, but they end up in the Ukraine as well, fairly close to where a lot of the Mennonites are living. Now, Catherine the Great extended all kinds of privileges to these people. You can run your own schools. You won't have to serve in the military. You can use whatever languages you want in your schools. We will give you land. So here, this colony, this is for you, Mennonites, and this one over here is for you, Lutherans, and this one's over here for you, Jewish people and Catholics. And the Russian government very much assumed that, well, we got to kind of put these people in separate places because no good could come of having them interact with each other, which actually, suited the Mennonites pretty well. It's like, oh, yeah, separating off by ourselves where people won't make trouble for us, that's good. The Russian government said you will not proselytize, at least not among Russian Orthodox people. Just do your thing by yourself, don't make waves, and we'll let you live your own lives. And so, this is perfect for a group of people who had really come to sort of define themselves now as being the quiet in the land. Another thing, and sort of the last main point we'll make here today, not surprisingly, early on in their story, the Anabaptists and the Mennonites show a real tendency toward division and fragmentation, which I suppose in a tradition that says you should kick out individuals who aren't living up to whatever Christians should live up to, the same thing is going to happen at the level of groups that disagree about that. We'll sort of kick the whole lot of you out, or maybe you'll just walk away and start your own version of Anabaptism. And this starts to happen over and over, and it's still happening to this day, as we'll see next week. So these won't all be on the test, by the way, but a few examples. Oh, you didn't know there was a test? Oh, I forgot to mention that. So early in the Dutch Mennonite story, for instance, there's this division between the Flemish and the Frisian Mennonites. And I don't begin to understand the entirety of this thing, but we'll make some gross oversimplifications here. So in the 1560s, there are Mennonites living in Flanders, which is now Belgium. And for some reason, people who come from Flanders are called Flemish. I can't quite connect that etymologically, but they are, so we'll just accept that. So the Flemish Mennonites move up into Friesland, which is a part of northern Netherlands where there were already lots of Mennonites. There was a little less persecution in Friesland, so they leave Belgium and move up there. And they come into contact with the local Frisian Dutch Mennonites. Frisian meaning Friesland. The Frisians thought that the Flemish were too worldly in the way that they dressed and in the way they conducted themselves, maybe a little too highfalutin, while the Flemish thought that the Frisians were too ostentatious in their homes and their furnishings and how much lace they had in their cupboards. And eventually, they find they cannot worship together based on these mutually held suspicions about each other. Eventually, the term ceased to have anything to do with geography. They just represented which side of that divide you fell on, but they were still called Flemish and Frisian. Eventually, the Dutch patch it up and realize that, we can let bygones be bygones. This isn't that important. But the Mennonites who leave the Netherlands and go to Poland and eventually go on to Russia take that division with them, and even into Russia, and perhaps in some of the more conservative groups even today, the legacy of that division still exists. They do communion differently, they baptize differently. So from the 1560s, an argument over how people dress and how they build their houses and how much lace they have in their cupboards, it still shapes the movement. The Amish division of 1693 would be another example of this. The Amish were Anabaptists, and before 1693, they were just Swiss Mennonites. But under the leadership of a man named Jacob Ammon, hence Amish, they start to argue about, largely over the question of how far one should go when you excommunicate someone. Is it enough just to kick them out of membership of the church, or should they be completely set aside and shunned? And the Amish were arguing, you need to take that more extreme view. We need to be more radically separated from the world. We need to be much more severe in our excommunication. A lot of the Swiss Mennonites were saying, excommunication is one thing, but this shunning may be a bit much. And they divide in 1693. And to this day, we have Amish as well as Mennonites. Now, one thing that I just learned a while back, and it's like it came as this revelation to me, but it really shouldn't. Today, the thing we know about the Amish is, they don't use technology. They dress differently. They don't drive cars. None of that played any part in the original Amish division. There, of course, were no cars. They were happy to use horse-drawn vehicles, which were the best technology anyone had at that time. And they dressed just like other people in Switzerland where they lived. Only over time, especially here in the United States, as modernity starts to make itself felt, did they start to raise these questions about, well, what does it mean to be separated from the world when all these crazy changes are happening around us? And while they don't reject those changes, they work much harder to slow them down and ask serious questions about them. We'll adopt some things, but not others, as opposed to most of the rest of us who just say, oh, cool, something new and shiny, let's do it. So that really only is a later thing for the Amish and does not define them to begin with. Really, it's the question of shunning that is the most important. The splits keep happening in Russia. So in 1814, you've got a fairly significant split in which a small group, in fact, they were so small, they became known as the Kleine Gemeinde, the little church, as opposed to the Großgemeinde, the big church. They're a little bit like the Amish, maybe not quite as extreme, but much greater emphasis on nonconformity, on humility, how they dress, church discipline, more conservative on those issues than other Mennonites in Russia at the time. They condemned card playing, smoking, drinking, higher education, musical instruments in church, mission work. Again, that's kind of a prideful sort of thing to run around and try to convert people. We should just be worried about being good, true Christians ourselves, and it's not our job to run around and coerce people into believing like us. They should see the self-evident truth of it and want to join us, but that's about as far as we'll go. Worldly acts or sentiments were punished with excommunication, followed by shunning. You don't laugh, you don't joke. These are serious people. All of my father's ancestors going back into Russia were Kleine Gemeinde, and some of yours were too. So that's a fairly small break that happens in Russia. The next really big one is one that we know more about, because it's the group that we have historically been a part of. It's not quite clear how much longer we will be part of it. But it will always be our DNA. I mean, no matter what happens going forward in terms of our relationship with the Mennonite Brethren Church, which is the group I'm talking about now, and even if we become Mennonite Church USA, more about that next week, our DNA is always going to tell us Mennonite Brethren is how we got to where we are. And so it just is. The Mennonite Brethren come into existence in 1860 in Russia. And some of the issues are somewhat the same. The larger sort of mainstream Mennonite church, and of course at this time you didn't have the same kind of denominational bureaucratic structures that we think of today. These were just mostly people who thought of themselves as Mennonites, and then a few groups that had split off and therefore taken their own identity. So the Kleine Gemeinde were differentiated from the Mennonites, and now the Mennonite Brethren would take that same route. So the larger Mennonite church is too lax in its church discipline. Did you know what happened at that wedding reception the other night? There was dancing. There was drinking out back. There, goodness knows what was happening. There were people shooting guns in the air. It was completely unchristian. And the church won't do anything about it. They won't discipline those people. This is unacceptable. And furthermore, that larger Mennonite church has become just a bunch of empty formality and ritual. This is the critique, at least. I'm not saying it's necessarily true, but it is what the Mennonite Brethren would have said. You just go through the catechism, you learn to say the right words, and when that point comes, you get baptized, usually just before it's time to get married, because you can't be married in the church if you're not baptized. One of the things genealogists learn in the old days is how often there's baptism, and then a few months later, there's marriage. What's that all about? The Mennonite Brethren would have argued that there has to be this more vital, personal, heartfelt salvation experience. And they are very much influenced by a couple of other movements going on at the time, one of which is Pietism, largely out of the Lutheran tradition, and then also Baptist church theology. So the Pietists, again, real oversimplification here, but one aspect of Pietism was this idea that any true Christian should be able to point back in their life to this inner struggle with sin. We're all sinful people. We're all separated from God because of that sin. And at some point, we have to realize that in a deep and visceral way. It's often going to be a long inner struggle in which finally you hit this crisis point and God helps you make this decision to start a new Christ-centered life. And for the Mennonite Brethren, that was absolutely central, often to the point where, I don't know about all you, but I remember when I was a kid, you're supposed to always have a testimony, and that testimony was somehow always supposed to have that kind of aspect to it. And some of us were pretty lame when it came to the whole sin thing. And it didn't really have much to work with, but you almost had to concoct it in order to prove that you had somehow had that experience. I see lots of nodding in the room. I'm not the only one. That's very much, I think, influenced by that tradition where that's what it means to be converted. You can't just have a non-dramatic, that thing I grew up with and was taught from the time I was born, that's me. Not good enough. Once I was lost in sin, then Jesus took me in, etc. The Mennonite Brethren were really big on that sort of thing. Those differences, that sort of the whole church discipline, church rules, and this idea of what it means to be saved eventually result in 18 Mennonite men in the Malachna colony, the largest of the Mennonite colonies in Russia, signing a document of secession, marking the birth of the Mennonite Brethren Church. It got ugly. The schism of 1860 was characterized by mutual animosity, mutual bad behavior on both sides, One of the ironies of Mennonites in Russia, because they're invited here, they're given all kinds of privileges, including the ability to largely run their own local governments. Mennonites running their own governments? Wait, what was that stuff I said earlier about Anabaptists and church and state? We're perilously close here at the local level to a church and state linkage in Russia again, and the Mennonites are helping run it. And a lot of those mainstream Mennonite leaders do use their connection to local civil government to harass this new movement. They threw some of them in jail for short times, went to the Russian government and said, these people aren't Mennonites anymore. You should take their privileges away from them. I mean, it was not pretty. The Mennonite Brethren, on the other hand, were extremely sanctimonious, often extremely rude in their accusations. They were somewhat holier than thou, I would argue, and probably brought a certain amount of this hostility on themselves because they were kind of obnoxious about it sometimes. That early experience has really shaped sort of Mennonite Brethren and Mennonite thinking about each other almost, well, to this day. In many ways, the hard feelings that came about as the result of that are significant. Now, whereas the Kleingemeinde were definitely a conservative movement, Mennonite Brethren not necessarily as much. You can actually argue that Mennonite Brethren were more progressive in some ways than the other Mennonites. They adopted new kinds of music, for instance. You think worship wars are new to our churches today? They're not. Mennonite Brethren were among the first to say, we should sing music where all the parts are written down. That makes better music than this weird sort of oral tradition thing that's done in other churches. And they gravitated toward that. They were quicker to say, we should be more evangelistic. We should go out and proselytize more, sometimes getting them in trouble with the Russian government. They were quicker to adopt those kind of things that a lot of Mennonites had held at arm's length. Mennonite Brethren also, within a few years of their founding, adopt a new mode of baptism. They decide we're going to immerse people when we baptize them. We're not just going to pour water on their heads like most other Mennonite groups did. This was definitely an influence from the Baptists, who I had mentioned were one of the groups that helped shape the Mennonite Brethren. We're almost done. And it becomes one of the most visible symbols that we're different than you. We have to go out to the river and actually put you underwater completely, as opposed to this little thing you do inside the church. I mentioned the animosity. So the fact that Mennonite Brethren do feel somewhat scarred by this relationship, and the fact that they're drawing a lot of their influences from other places, makes them somewhat ambivalent about what it actually means to be Mennonite. And I think Mennonite Brethren have often been quicker than some other Mennonite groups to say, we're not quite sure this Mennonite thing is really all that good of an idea. It's an attitude that I think has persisted to this day. Mennonite Brethren refuse to recognize those baptisms. So if you were a member of a different Mennonite church who wanted to become Mennonite Brethren, you would have to be re-baptized. That, Russian Mennonite pouring, it does not count. And my daughter is not marrying your son if he's one of those Mennonites. That is not to be tolerated. That animosity persists for a very long time, even to this day, and even in some of our families. There are stories right up into the mid-20th century of people, who had to be rebaptized in order to become Mennonite Brethren, and weren't all that thrilled about it, actually. Okay, we have used up an hour. That is a frantically fast summary. Are there any questions? I'm pretty sure I didn't leave anything out, but just in case I did. So next week, thanks. Next week, we'll pick up the story here in the United States. We'll explain what is this MCGC MB stuff. What's that mean? Some of those kind of aspects to finish up the story. So I hope you're all back next Sunday. If any of you want to come up and pet the rare books, you can do that. Thanks. Oh, is there a question? I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you. I'm sorry. Well, I'll talk about that next week. The country with the most Mennonites in it is the United States, and the largest group there would be a group called the Mennonite Church USA. It's the one that we will probably soon be members of. Now, as we'll find out though next week, the other countries that have the most Mennonites, Ethiopia, Congo, and India. And now that's a whole different story. We'll talk about how that happens last week, because those people did not migrate from Poland and Russia to get to those places. There's a different way they became Mennonites. So yeah, Mennonite Church USA would be the biggest one right now in the United States. All right, thanks y'all. See you next week.